Welcome back to our next micro lecture for this module. Today we're going to be discussing the different types of drug use that are available to us, potential behaviors associated with abuse and full-blown addiction, and we will end our discussion with the most common demographic features of drug users in the United States today. In other words, we'll discuss who our drug users are. Drug abuse is known as chemical or substance abuse and is the willful misuse of either licit or illicit drugs for the purpose of recreation, perceived necessity, or convenience. Drug abuse can occur no matter what you're using. Clearly, our friend here is pretending to mainline a illicit substance, but if he's trying to consume that much coffee, then he's being a little bit abusive of the world's best drink. So overall, what do we mean by drug abuse? It means that you're using the substance too much, too often, and in too great a dose to be considered normal or recommended. This is for recreational purposes, or it's necessary because your body needs the drug to stay even. Drug abuse also refers to a more intense misuse of drugs, often to the point of addiction. This is known as chemical or substance abuse. So you're misusing the drug so much that you have now created a psychological and physical dependence on the drug. If at any point you start to go into withdrawal from that substance, then you are in the addiction range. For example, that you know that if you are a consistent coffee drinker, there is a low level of dependence that can be created. You know how you feel on days when you can't get a cup of coffee. For me, skipping a day of coffee often results in a headache, and sometimes I can get a little shaky. A quick cup of coffee and that feeling goes away. Can you imagine how much worse it gets when you can't get your regular dose of oxy or heroin? The withdrawal symptoms are much worse and without assistance can kill you depending on what you're withdrawing from. As we have discussed, there are many different types of legal and illegal drugs. There are also different ways in which we can use them for either their intended purpose or for more recreational means. There are 4 different ways in which we can classify drug use. The first is legal instrumental use, meaning that you're taking the prescribed drug or the over-the-counter drug to relieve or treat mental or physical symptoms. You're taking the drug correctly to treat the correct illness. You're taking cough medicine to treat your cough. You have a headache and you take Tylenol. You only treat it when you need it, and you only take it for the thing that it is supposed to treat. The next is legal recreational use, meaning that you're using illicit drugs like tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine to achieve a certain mental state. The drug itself is legal, but doesn't really have a prescribed medical use. You're taking it because you enjoy the taste of alcohol or you're trying to get drunk. You're drinking the coffee because you're not coherent until you have at least 2 cups. But here you're just taking the drug because it's an enjoyable experience for you. You can still become addicted to these drugs and develop a dependency, but they're legal compared to other types of drugs that fall into the illegal recreational use category. Next up, we have illegal instrumental use, which means you are taking non-prescribed drugs to achieve a task or a goal. This is the flip side of what we were talking about before. You're no longer using the NyQuil to calm your cough. You're using it as a sleep aid. This has actually happened so often that the makers of NyQuil created a separate medicine called ZQuil, so we would stop chugging NyQuil all the time. Your goal is different than the intended use of the drug. So Sudafed is a fantastic example. It is used to break up the congestion and sinus pressure that we all have when we're sick. But what else does Sudafed help us do? It's an ingredient to help cook methamphetamine. That's why you need to provide the pharmacy with your driver's license if you're purchasing the extra strength Sudafed, Sudafed D. Finally, we have illegal recreational use, which means you're taking illicit drugs for fun or pleasure. The former governor of California is smoking pot because he likes to get high. I might be using Molly or MDMA ecstasy because I want to feel the feelings of euphoria and inner peace that come with the hallucinations. This is the category that we are most worried about because recreation can often turn into something larger. When you have all of these people taking drugs for a variety of different reasons, you're creating a high demand market that both companies and dealers have taken advantage of. We are spending so much money every year on the consumption of licit and illicit drugs. For example, the average American spends roughly $579 per year on alcohol alone, according to statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is just for social drinkers alone. For heavy drinkers who average roughly 14 drinks or more per week, the CDC estimates that these individuals spend upwards of $5,000 per year, depending on which market they reside. In 2022, the marijuana industry set a record high with Americans spending more than $30 billion on legal marijuana. As a comparison, the country only spent $20 billion on chocolate the same year. Collectively, the U.S. spends roughly $387 billion on prescription drugs per year, according to data from 2021. This accounts for the 70% of Americans who are on at least one prescription drug. And we're prescribed things now that never existed for our parents and grandparents. A lot of the drugs that we take now didn't even exist 30 plus years ago. We have had a large boom of pills be released in the last 3 decades. Some of the most popular have actually been created by accident. For example, Viagra. It was originally a heart medication and then had this tiny little side effect in men, and it was rather beneficial in that regard in comparison to the heart treatment. But the funny thing is, if you want to use Viagra and you have a heart condition, then you're going to need to take something else before you can use the Viagra. This was a miracle pill to men everywhere, but it was the pill of the century for Pfizer. Overall, what does this tell us? From this data, we clearly like to drink and smoke and keep ourselves alive with prescription drugs, and we will gladly spend a lot of money to do so. These are mega industries that we're talking about, and it's only the tip of the iceberg. This doesn't even take into account illegal markets and the money that we spend there. So let's talk about who is using what for a moment. Across the country, alcohol and tobacco use remains a strong priority for Americans. Let's focus instead on the other substances. In 2021, more than 52 million people reported that they used marijuana within that year. More than half of Americans reported using weed at least once in their lifetime. When you break that down further into legal states and regular smokers, more than 30% of the Washington, D.C. area residents report using routinely. This is an interesting statistic, specifically because you can legally use and possess marijuana in D.C., but you cannot purchase it legally. In comparison to much harder substances like cocaine, only 4.8 million, or about 1.7% of Americans use cocaine in 2021. This is a significantly smaller percentage compared to marijuana use. In 2017, the CDC reports that there were more than 58 prescriptions written for every 100 Americans. That means more than 17% of Americans had at least one opioid prescription filled, with an average of 3.4 opioid prescriptions dispensed per patient. While this seems like a lot, and it is, there have been significant efforts made to stop the drastic overprescription methods that doctors had been prescribing for years. The National Institute of Health, or NIH, finds that for most age groups, men have higher rates of use or dependence on illicit drugs and alcohol compared to women. However, women are just as likely as men to develop a substance use disorder. Research also suggests that women often use drugs differently, respond to drugs differently, and can have unique obstacles to effective treatment as as simple as not being able to find childcare or being prescribed treatment that has not been adequately tested on women. There are often different responses to the drugs as well based on use. For example, women are much more likely to lose spatial awareness compared to men when using marijuana. Men also seem to achieve a stronger high than most women. When using cocaine, women may become more sensitive than men to the cocaine's effects on the heart and blood vessels. In contrast, female and male cocaine users show similar deficits in learning, concentration, and academic achievement, even if the women had been using it for longer. Female cocaine users are also less likely than male users to exhibit abnormalities of blood flow in the brain's frontal regions. These findings suggest a sex-related mechanism that may protect women from some of the detrimental effects of cocaine use on the brain. In addition to gender, there are some other rates of drug use to discuss. In terms of education, only 5.4% of Americans with a college degree reported consistent illicit drug use in the last year. High school graduates reported an 11.1 use rate during that same time. These low use rates are pretty routine, with the trend indicating that the more education you receive, the less likely you are to report drug use. What are some reasons for that? There might be more to lose for some individuals. Higher levels of education are normally correlated with stronger levels of employment. Do you want to lose your job? Probably not. The one thing that is actually positively correlated with levels of education is binge drinking. Binge drinking is pretty popular among college students, especially on the weekends, but that is still illicit substance use. Unemployed individuals report higher drug use than those who are full-time employees. What are some reasons for that? Why might they be unemployed? Is it because of the drugs? Is it because of criminal records? If I am unemployed, do I care as much about using? Some individuals who are unemployed might be temporarily unemployed and are in search of other jobs, so they still won't use. But those that are chronically unemployed might not care as much about using. What else do they have to lose? For those who are involved with the criminal justice system, we see that roughly 1/3 of state and 1/4 of federal prisoners were under the influence while they did commit their crime. This does not necessarily mean that they committed a drug crime, simply that they were under the influence of something when they committed their crime. They certainly could have been charged with a drug crime as well if they were in possession of an illegal substance at the time of their arrest. Or at the very least, they could have had a public intoxication charge thrown at them. So these individuals are arrested one day. They're going to be released into the community, a lot of them still under probation or parole supervision. In terms of those on community supervision, roughly 20% of state offenders will violate the terms of their supervision for a drug violation. In comparison, over 50% of federal offenders will violate the terms of their supervision for the same violation. Violations for conditional release are quite frequent with offenders. This could be testing dirty, this could be a new drug crime, or this could be something else that violated their release conditions. Why do you think that federal prisoners violate more often? One reason might be due to the larger amount of drug crimes prosecuted by the federal government. There is simply a higher number of those individuals being arrested for drug offenses than there are at the state level. This concludes our second micro lecture for the module. In the final micro lecture this week, we're going to wind things down by dissecting drug use in the workplace, drug testing, welfare programs, and how this influences drug treatment programs and policies. Join me next time for our short discussion on these topics.